March 24th, 1945, midday, a forward command post near the Rhine. The tent canvas rippled in the wind, snapping like distant rifle fire. Inside, beneath the yellow glow of field lamps, maps lay spread across wooden tables, blue lines marking rivers, red arrows marking advances, black crosses marking what had been. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of rain-soaked equipment. Outside, the mechanical symphony of war continued its relentless rhythm, the growl of Sherman tanks maneuvering into position, the whistle of supply trucks reversing through mud, the staccato voices of radio operators calling coordinates into crackling handsets. George S. Patton, Jr. stood with one hand on his hip, the other resting on the ivory handle of his revolver, a weapon more theatrical than practical. But then, Patton understood theater. He had just received confirmation from his forward units. The Third Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim the night before. No grand bombardment, no weeks of preparation, no airborne spectacle choreographed for newsreel cameras, just boats in the darkness, men wading through cold water, and by dawn, American boots on the eastern bank. When the telephone connection to Supreme Headquarters finally crackled through, Patton's voice carried the casual tone of a man reporting yesterday's weather. "General Eisenhower," he said, "I have crossed the Rhine." A pause. Then, with the timing of a stage actor who knows his audience, "Do you want me to give it back?" The question was not a question at all. It was a statement of fait accompli, wrapped in the gauze of false humility. Patton knew what he had done. He had violated protocol, bypassed planning hierarchies, ignored the carefully orchestrated schedule that placed Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's crossing to the north as the centerpiece of Allied operations. He had seized initiative not because he was ordered to, but because he understood something fundamental about warfare that no amount of staff college education could teach. That momentum, once gained, must never be surrendered. The Rhine was not merely a river. It was the jugular vein of German defense, the last geographical barrier between the Allied armies and the industrial heart of the Reich. To cross it meant to break not only a defensive line, but a psychological fortress, the German belief that their homeland could still be defended, that the war could still be salvaged, that some miracle might yet reverse the tide of history. Patton had delivered that break in the darkness, swiftly and decisively. Now he waited for Eisenhower's response, knowing that the Supreme Commander faced a choice that had nothing to do with military tactics and everything to do with managing personalities, politics, and the fragile coalition that held the Allied command together. Eisenhower's reply, when it came, was a masterpiece of controlled exasperation. "Don't be funny, George," he said, his voice carrying both rebuke and reluctant admiration. Then, after a breath that seemed to stretch across continents, "Congratulations, keep going." 2 words, keep going. In them resided not merely permission, but liberation, a green light for the Third Army to plunge eastward into Germany without restraint, without the careful coordination that had characterized every major operation since Normandy. Eisenhower understood that Patton had presented him with a gift disguised as insubordination. The Rhine was crossed, the bridgehead was secure, the enemy was reeling. To halt now, to consolidate and wait for Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder to unfold, would be to throw away the advantage. And so Eisenhower, the diplomat in uniform, the man who had spent more time managing egos than commanding battles, made the only decision that history would forgive. He let Patton off the leash. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must step backward into the long shadow of the Rhine itself, that ancient river that had divided civilizations for millennia. To the Romans, it was the Rhenus, the boundary between imperium and barbarism. Caesar had bridged it in 10 days as a demonstration of Roman engineering and will. To medieval emperors, it was the spine of the Holy Roman Empire, its castles and toll stations controlling the lifeblood of commerce. To Napoleon, it was the gateway to German submission, crossed and recrossed as French armies redrew the map of Europe. And to Adolf Hitler in 1945, it was the last moat protecting the fatherland, the final line that must not be yielded. The Führer had ordered every bridge destroyed, every crossing fortified, every span of shoreline defended to the last man. Propaganda broadcasts assured the German people that the Rhine would be their salvation, that Allied armies would break themselves against its currents like waves against stone. The river had become more than geography. It had become mythology, a talisman of survival. The Allies, for their part, understood the psychological weight of the Rhine as clearly as they understood its tactical importance. Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group in the north, had spent months planning Operation Plunder, an elaborate set-piece assault involving 25,000 airborne troops, more than 1,000 artillery pieces, and waves of bombers pulverizing German positions before the first boat touched water. It was to be the grand finale of the European campaign, a textbook demonstration of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Churchill himself planned to watch from the western bank, cigar in hand, as British and American troops crossed into Germany under skies darkened by transport planes and gliders. The operation was scheduled for March 23rd. Montgomery's crossing would be the crossing, the one written into history books, the symbolic threshold between war and victory. Patton despised every element of this plan, not because it was unsound. Tactically, Operation Plunder was brilliant, but because it was slow. Patton believed in speed the way monks believe in prayer, as the fundamental organizing principle of existence. He had spent the autumn and winter of 1944 driving his Third Army eastward across France and into the Saar region, with a velocity that outstripped supply lines, outpaced headquarters directives, and outraged more methodical commanders. His tanks ran on gasoline scrounged from captured depots. His infantry marched through nights when they should have been resting. His staff officers worked with maps that were outdated before they were printed, because Patton moved faster than cartographers could draw. By early March 1945, the Third Army had reached the Rhine near the city of Mainz, and Patton began studying the river with the intensity of a predator watching prey. He did not want a grand assault. He wanted a knife thrust in the dark. The section of the Rhine near Oppenheim was narrow, less defended than the sectors to the north and south, overlooked by German planners who assumed the Allies would strike where the river was widest and most dramatic. Patton saw opportunity in that oversight. On the night of March 22nd, one day before Montgomery's elaborate crossing was scheduled to begin, Patton gave the order. Elements of the 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine in assault boats, engineers rowing through the darkness while artillery laid down suppressive fire on the eastern bank. German defenders, surprised and disorganized, responded with scattered machine gun bursts and mortar rounds that fell wide. By dawn on March 23rd, more than 1,000 American soldiers were across. By midday, pontoon bridges were under construction. By evening, tanks were rolling eastward. The crossing had cost fewer than 30 casualties. It was, in military terms, a coup de main, a sudden, decisive stroke that changed the calculus of everything that followed. What the German soldiers on the eastern bank experienced that night was not the apocalypse they had been promised, but something more insidious: irrelevance. They had been told the Rhine was impassable, that the Allies would announce their crossings with thunder and fire, that there would be time to prepare, to dig in, to die gloriously in defense of the fatherland. Instead, the Americans came quietly in the darkness and were among them before orders could be given or positions manned. A German corporal, captured in the initial wave, later told interrogators, "We heard engines on the water. We thought they were our own boats, repositioning. By the time we understood, they were already ashore. We fired, but it was like shooting at shadows. Then their artillery began, and we ran." His unit retreated eastward, joining the great unraveling that characterized German resistance in the final months of the war. Within hours, the myth of the Rhine as an insurmountable barrier had evaporated like morning fog. The psychological impact of Patton's crossing rippled through the Wehrmacht with devastating speed. Reports from German units stationed along the river spoke of confusion, demoralization, and a pervasive sense of betrayal. They had been promised reinforcements that never arrived. They had been told that the Luftwaffe would contest Allied air superiority, but the skies remained empty of German planes, filled instead with the endless drone of American and British bombers. They had been assured that new wonder weapons would turn the tide, But the V-2 rockets and jet fighters existed only in quantities too small to matter. The Rhine was supposed to be the line where all of this would coalesce, where German resolve would harden into something unbreakable. Instead, Patton had crossed it as casually as a man stepping over a puddle, and the entire architecture of German hope collapsed. Among the records preserved from those chaotic weeks is a diary entry from a German lieutenant stationed near Darmstadt, just east of the Rhine. He wrote on March 25th, 2 days after Patton's crossing, "The Americans are across, not in one place, but everywhere. We receive orders to hold, but hold what? There are no lines anymore, only chaos. Refugees clog the roads. Soldiers without units wander eastward, looking for someone to surrender to. Last night I watched American planes drop supplies to their advancing columns, parachutes falling like snow, crates of food and ammunition delivered with precision. We have not seen a supply convoy in weeks. Our rations are turnips and black bread. How do you fight an enemy who can conjure abundance from the sky?" This observation, the contrast between American plenty and German deprivation, recurred again and again in the testimonies of captured soldiers. The symbol of this disparity became the sea ration, that humble tin of combat food that American soldiers carried by the millions. German troops, subsisting on dwindling supplies of ersatz coffee and stale bread, were astonished when they overran American positions and found the abandoned sea rations, cans of meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, even toilet paper. One Wehrmacht sergeant, interrogated after his capture, fixated on the cigarettes. "We had been smoking birch bark and dried leaves," he said. "Then we found American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, boxes and boxes of them, just lying in the mud. I thought, how can we defeat a nation that throws away cigarettes?" The sea ration became more than food. It became proof of an industrial capacity so vast, a logistical network so efficient, that the outcome of the war was never truly in doubt. The Germans had fought with courage and skill, but they had fought against an opponent who could afford to be wasteful, who could supply armies on the far side of an ocean with luxuries that the Reich could not provide to its own soldiers on home soil. Patton's advance eastward from the Rhine bridgehead at Oppenheim was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a pursuit, a running chase across southern Germany as the Wehrmacht disintegrated. Towns fell with barely a shot fired. Entire battalions surrendered en masse, their officers relieved to have an excuse to stop retreating. The Third Army covered distances in days that would have taken weeks in 1944. Patton drove his staff mercilessly, demanding updates every hour, issuing orders that pushed exhausted units beyond their limits. "We are advancing so fast," he told one of his division commanders, "that the Germans don't know whether we're coming or going. Keep them confused, keep them running." His goal was no longer tactical, it was psychological. He wanted to break the German will to resist, to make surrender seem not shameful, but inevitable, to flood the roads with refugees and defeated soldiers until the entire infrastructure of German resistance collapsed under its own weight. But the advance also revealed something darker, something that no amount of speed or aggression could erase. As the Third Army pushed deeper into Germany, they began liberating the camps. Ohrdruf was the first, a subcamp of Buchenwald discovered on April 4th, 1945. Patton ordered his men to tour the site, to see the piles of emaciated corpses, the crude crematoria, the barracks where prisoners had been worked to death. He brought journalists, brought photographers, brought senior officers who had spent years fighting without fully understanding what they were fighting against. Patton himself, a man who had seen battlefields strewn with the dead, was shaken. "I have been in war for 30 years, he wrote in his diary, "and have seen men die in every imaginable way, but I have never seen anything so calculated, so cold-blooded." The camps were proof, irrefutable and horrifying, that the ideology animating the Third Reich was not merely authoritarian but genocidal. The sea rations that American soldiers handed to liberated prisoners, those same tins that had symbolized abundance to captured Wehrmacht troops, now became instruments of mercy, life delivered in cans to people who had been systematically starved. The transformation this wrought in the American soldiers who witnessed it was profound. Many had crossed the Atlantic with only a vague sense of purpose, fighting because they had been called to fight, not because they felt a personal stake in the outcome. The camps changed that. Letters home from soldiers in the Third Army in April 1945 are filled with a new tone. Not the bravado of combat veterans or the weary resignation of men who had seen too much, but a kind of cold fury. "Now I know why we're here," wrote a private from Indiana. "Not to occupy Germany, but to end this, to make sure it can never happen again." The discovery of the camps transformed the war from a geopolitical struggle into a moral crusade, and it transformed the soldiers who fought it from participants in history into witnesses to atrocity. Eisenhower's decision to let Patton keep going after the Rhine crossing was, in hindsight, one of the most consequential choices of the war's final phase. It allowed the Third Army to become the spear point of the Allied advance in the south, to drive deep into Bavaria and Austria, to liberate camps and capture territory at a pace that would have been impossible under a more cautious command structure. But it also highlighted the tension at the heart of coalition warfare, the need to balance military effectiveness with political sensibility. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, launched on schedule on March 23rd, was a stunning success by any objective measure. Thousands of troops crossed the Rhine. Bridges were constructed and the northern route into Germany was secured, but it was overshadowed by Patton's quiet, unsanctioned crossing the night before. British newspapers celebrated Montgomery. American newspapers celebrated Patton. The rivalry between the two men, never subtle, became a public spectacle. Eisenhower, caught in the middle, managed the egos and the headlines with the skill of a politician, praising both men publicly while privately acknowledging that Patton's audacity had achieved what Montgomery's methodical planning could not, a crossing so swift and unexpected that it shattered German morale before they could mount a coherent response. The question Patton asked, "Do you want me to give it back?" has echoed through the decades as a kind of shorthand for the tension between boldness and obedience, between seizing opportunity and following orders. It was not, strictly speaking, insubordination. Patton had crossed the Rhine within the broad framework of Eisenhower's operational plan, but he had done so without coordination, without clearance, without waiting for the conditions that headquarters deemed necessary. In doing so, he had forced Eisenhower's hand, presented him with a fait accompli that could not be undone. The Rhine was crossed. The bridgehead was secure. To order a withdrawal would have been absurd. And so Eisenhower, the man who had spent the war balancing the demands of Churchill and Roosevelt, of Montgomery and Patton, of British pride and American impatience, made the only choice available. He endorsed the gamble and let Patton run. In the decades since, historians have debated whether Patton's crossing was a masterstroke of opportunistic warfare or a reckless violation of command discipline. The answer, perhaps, is that it was both. Patton was a deeply flawed man, vain, temperamental, prone to outbursts that embarrassed his superiors and endangered his career. But he was also a warrior of rare instinct, capable of reading the flow of battle with a clarity that transcended doctrine. He understood that the Rhine crossing was not merely a tactical objective but a psychological threshold, and that crossing it quickly, before the Germans could consolidate their defenses, was worth any amount of bureaucratic friction. Eisenhower, for his part, understood that managing Patton was less about controlling him than about pointing him in the right direction, and then staying out of his way. "Keep going," he said, and in those two words acknowledged a truth that commanders throughout history have learned and forgotten and learned again, that sometimes the greatest victories belong not to those who plan perfectly, but to those who act decisively when the moment demands it. The C-ration tins, scattered across the battlefields of southern Germany in the spring of 1945, remained long after the armies had moved on. Some were collected by German civilians as souvenirs of the occupation. Some were opened and consumed by starving refugees. Some rusted into the mud, small testaments to an industrial capacity that had tipped the balance of the war as surely as any tank or bomber. They were ordinary objects, mass-produced and unremarkable, but they carried an extraordinary weight of meaning. To the American soldiers who carried them, they were sustenance. To the German soldiers who captured them, they were proof of insurmountable odds. To the prisoners liberated from camps, they were salvation. And to the historians who would later sift through the detritus of war, they were symbols of a larger truth, that victory in the Second World War was not won by ideology or rhetoric, but by the grinding, relentless application of resources that one side possessed and the other did not. Patton did not live to see the full arc of his legacy. He died in December 1945, killed not by enemy fire, but by a car accident in occupied Germany, his body broken in a collision that seemed almost absurdly anticlimactic for a man who had spent his life courting death on battlefields. But his crossing of the Rhine, and the question he asked Eisenhower afterward, became part of the mythology of the war, a story retold in memoirs and documentaries, a moment frozen in the amber of history. It was a reminder that wars are won not only by nations and armies, but by individuals willing to take risks that others would not, to act when action was needed, to ask questions that forced history to answer. The Rhine flows still, carving its ancient path through the heart of Europe, indifferent to the men who crossed it and the blood that stained its banks. The bridges that Patton's engineers built are long gone, replaced by modern spans of steel and concrete. The towns that his army liberated have been rebuilt, their scars hidden beneath decades of peace. But the question lingers, echoing across the years like a voice carried on the wind. Do you want me to give it back? It was a question born of audacity and opportunity, of a moment when hesitation would have meant stagnation and boldness meant breakthrough. And Eisenhower's answer, terse, pragmatic, and laced with the weary understanding of a man who knew he was managing genius and madness in equal measure, was the only answer that history would accept. Keep going. And they did, across the river and into the heart of darkness, until the beast was slain and the long night ended. The Rhine was crossed. There was no giving it back.